Sam Raimi never got to complete his vision for Spider-Man. He meant to do at least 3 more movies that would have further explored Peter trying to balance his romance with Mary Jane with his career as Spider-Man, and I thought this would be a perfect opportunity to tell a crossover story with a new and unique hero named Robocop. In short, what if Spider-Man and Robocop were in the same universe? Our story begins after the events of Spider-Man 3. At the end of that movie, Peter and Mary Jane were dancing together at her jazz club, and it was implied that they would probably get back together, and so they have. Gwen Stacy is nothing but a distant memory, and these two are finally on the same page again. Peter has gotten over his big-headedness from the last movie, and he's become the humble and friendly neighborhood Spider-Man that we all know and love. In fact, we begin this movie with Peter and MJ getting married to each other. However, there is one major difference that we notice. Peter isn't going out as Spider-Man anywhere near as often. When MJ needs Peter to be there for her, he's there for her. He's finally learned what it means to be a husband, aka to put your spouse before yourself. And we see that, well, Peter is happy spending more time with her and trying not to make the same mistakes he made in the last movie. He harbors a regret about every person he's not there to save. He actually has a lot of nightmares about it. And sadly for Peter, his nightmares prove well-founded, because crime rates in New York have considerably risen in wake of his more loosey-goosey schedule, particularly thanks to the efforts of a man named Clarence Boddicker. Also, it should be noted that the police have started to noticeably slack just a little bit due to an over-reliance on Spider-Man. I personally think that's something that should be addressed in superhero movies more often. I mean, in Batman Forever, Commissioner Gordon literally was waiting for Batman to save the day constantly. He couldn't do anything without Batman nearby, and that's the case with Spider-Man and the police in this movie. So now with the NYPD's independence at an all-time low, the city decides it needs a good kick in the ass, and they allow a new rising robotics company named Omni Consumer Products, or OCP, to take over the police department. OCP has basically taken over where Oscorp Industries left off. Oscorp basically doesn't exist anymore, with all the Osborns, well, deceased. Now OCP begins working on a cybernetic replacement for the police in order to fill the void that Spider-Man has left behind, as well as save the lives of a bunch of human officers. However, as it happened in the actual movie, the Ed 209 demonstration doesn't exactly go very well, and Bob Morton's Robocop program begins to take more steam. So now Alex Murphy, as he did, gets reassigned, this time to the NYPD, and gains the same partner in Ann Lewis. Now, sadly, just as it happened, Murphy ends up being brutally mutilated and murdered by Clarence Boddicker, and when Peter hears about this on the news, he feels insanely guilty. He feels like he could have done something to stop that from happening, but he's also conflicted because he had to be there for Mary Jane. But sure enough, J. Jonah Jameson leaps the hell onto this, and he slanders Spider-Man for his absence. He even claims somehow that the reason we haven't seen Clarence Boddicker until now is that Clarence somehow is Spider-Man. So now Peter is starting to step up his game a bit more, and we get the Spider-Man that everyone remembers, the one that they gave the key to the city to, but luckily now he's learned how to better balance this with his marriage. Now soon after, we see the debut of Robocop on the streets of New York. He starts taking out criminals whenever Spider-Man's not around, and JJ gets to have another comedic scene where he calls the name Robocop crap and says he can come up with a better name. He then just sits down and just quietly thinks for a really long time awkwardly, with Hoffman just staring at him expectantly, before JJ just says to hell with it and prints his name as Robocop. He honestly doesn't care that much about the name, he's just thrilled that he has a big name to print that isn't Spider-Man or one of his villains. Now, when Peter first hears about Robocop, he doesn't really know how to feel about him, because yeah, I mean, he's been there when he can't be, but he also knows that he hasn't had the best track record when it comes to experiments gone wrong, so he's kind of paranoid about Robocop turning evil. However, he gets to meet him for the first time when they both appear at the City Hall to try and apprehend Ron Miller and save all the hostages. Now, Spider-Man tries to crawl in through a window, where Robocop just simply smashes through the wall and grabs Miller. He then tosses him outside, but Spider-Man catches him and webs him up. Robocop then turns to Spider-Man, but he has to fight the urge to attack him, because I mean, yeah, OCP of course don't want Spider-Man around anymore, since without him, Robocop will be a lot easier to sell to people. So Robocop is forced to attack Spider-Man, and Peter barely escapes. So now later on, Jameson sends Peter down to the NYPD in order to take more pictures of Robocop, and there Peter is able to ask him some questions, like why he attacked Spider-Man, and that's where he learns that he was just programmed to do that. Now unbeknownst to Peter, but Robocop actually recorded his voice. This is going to be important later. So now we get a montage of Robocop cleaning up the city's crime, and we even see him and Spider-Man are forced to fight each other once again. And we see soon after their fight, he's able to match Peter's voice with Spider-Man's, and he's able to learn that they're the same person. And now soon after this, Peter learns that Mary Jane is actually pregnant, and Peter is starting to see Robocop as his way out, his reason to retire from being Spider-Man. However, then Dick Jones turns the NYPD against Robocop. Now weakened and without many allies, Robocop tells Anne to drive him to Peter's apartment, but before he goes there, he's able to deactivate the programming that forces him to kill Spider-Man. He then reveals to Peter that he knows his secret identity, and he says that there's a very real risk that OCP will search through his memory files, and the world may learn about Peter's secret identity. So he asks Peter to please help him against both Clarence Boddicker and Dick Jones, and Peter of course agrees to team up with him, and the pair are able to take out both of them, and with Spider-Man's help actually, neither of them end up being killed. They instead just get arrested, and they expose every corrupt person at OCP. So now Peter decides he can't fully retire as Spider-Man, since there will always be too much crime for just Robocop alone, so he decides he's going to try and balance his dual identities. We then cut a while later, and MJ has given birth to a daughter named Anna Mae Parker, and this is a beautiful scene, and we overhear Peter narrating about how he's entering a new part of his life, and for once, he doesn't feel like he has to do it alone. He then hears police sirens go off, and MJ just looks at him, and she's clearly worried he's gonna leave her again, but then Peter sits down beside her, and they hold hands just like they did in the first movie. We then see Robocop doing what Spider-Man couldn't at that moment. New York will always need Spider-Man, but maybe one more hero couldn't hurt. So that is my scenario for Spider-Man crossing over with Robocop. So yeah, okay. I admit that I wasn't going to do this one at first. I was just going to stick to Terminator, Alien, and Predator. But you know, it just felt wrong to leave Robocop out. You know what I mean? He feels like he belongs with those other three, just in my opinion. And I saw a storyline potential there. And I decided to do it in, like after Spider-Man 3, mostly just because I like the idea of Robocop, you know, sort of being there when Spider-Man can't be. And Spider-Man, the first three movies, I think, was, you know, always there. You know what I mean? He always put being Spider-Man over being Peter Parker. But now he's in a position where he wants to be Peter Parker more, you know, because he's marrying Mary Jane and, you know, they're about to have a kid together. And I think it would just make sense for Robocop to be in this part of the story, because then, you know, it won't be them, you know, constantly, you know, teaming up, because I think that would get a little bit boring. Instead, it would just be Robocop kind of, you know, being able to be there when Spider-Man can't be. You know what I mean? I don't know. I just think that sounds interesting. But yeah, I mean, I hope you guys enjoy this scenario. I admit I wasn't going to do this one at first, and I did kind of struggle a little bit with the story, because I didn't know if I should incorporate elements of Robocop 2 and 3, or if, since it's in a modern day and not in the 80s, if I should do the Joel Kinnaman Robocop instead. I kind of debated about it. And I know the fact that Robocop takes place when it does is important to the story, you know, with all the political elements of it. I'm well aware of the fact that some of you are going to hate the fact that I've done this crossover the way I've done it, you know, because it's not in the 80s, and I know that Robocop is very much, you know, an 80s character, so I understand completely if you guys are bothered by that. I could understand that, I really could. And, you know, I tried to do something different. I tried to do a storyline I think would make sense, and, you know, I honestly honestly think crossing these two over wouldn't ruin either of their stories. I think Robocop's presence would, bring an interesting, new fold into Peter's story about whether or not he really wants to be Spider-Man at all, or at least not quite as often, with a new hero there to help out, which he hasn't had before, because before this he's been all New York Scott, you know what I mean? And as far as the police getting off their asses after relying too much on superheroes, I know that they're not necessarily incompetent in the Spider-Man movies, but, the fact that the city was willing to hold a celebration for somebody they originally thought of as a vigilante kind of tells me that maybe the police were starting to rely a little too much on Spider-Man as well. I don't know. That's kind of my opinion. And, there have been movies that admit that the police do rely too much on superheroes, like the Lego Batman movie. But overall, I don't think movies address it enough. And I think the fact that Robocop is actually a product of the police department, or OCP, you get what I mean, and Spider-Man still works outside the law, I think it would be really interesting. You know what I mean? It would be kind of a Batman, Harvey Dent, Dark Knight situation where Batman was going to retire because Harvey Dent can fight crime and do it, inside the law instead of outside. Stuff like that. I don't know. I think that would be an interesting storyline for Spider-Man as well. And I think Robocop would be a really interesting way to do it. But let me know in the comments down below if you disagree with any of the decisions I've made. I know I kept this one kind of brief. As I said, it went through a few rewrites, and I didn't end up having a lot of time with it, so I hope that it came out as good as I hope it did. I said that a lot of times, I'm sorry. But either way, I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please make sure to give it a thumbs up, and share with all of your friends on all your various social media platforms. And speaking of social media, don't forget to follow me on Instagram, Rinzler_Productions, and I'll see all of you in the next video.